to date on the Bourbon Bytes Podcast. We're wrapping up the year with some of my biggest wishes for 2026. From personal goals to the Bourbon Bytes platform and even the world of bourbon and whiskey in the new year. And lastly, I give my final bite-sized review of the year. The new Willett Family Estate 4-year-old small batch cask strength bourbon whiskey. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bourbon Bytes Podcast. I'm your host, Clifton, and this is the week of Thursday, December 18th, 2025. So this will be the last episode of the Bourbon Bytes Podcast for the year. So we're going to consider this like a mid-season break where I take a few weeks off and then come back to you early January/mid-January, whenever we feel like the time is right. So since this will be the last episode of the year, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about my hopes and dreams for 2026. And I mean that very broadly. I don't just mean for myself or for the podcast or the YouTube channel, but for the bourbon and whiskey industry in general. I want to just kind of make this like putting it out there in the universe episode of the podcast, and we'll see what happens. Now, another reason I'm doing this is because there's really not much more news stories than I've already reported on this month. A lot of whiskeys are being put out early next year, which I talked about in last week's episode. And we really have gotten the most we can get out of the industry this year. I'm still working on putting together my top 10 whiskeys of the year. I have a short list, I would say, of about 15 or so that I'm going to narrow down in the next day or two. I will be premiering this on my YouTube channel at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2026. And I'm really looking forward to sharing what whiskeys, mostly bourbons, but there's a few other exceptions out there as well, have really caught my eye and really just exceeded my expectations this year. Now, of course, I do have one more whiskey I'm going to review on this episode of the podcast that is a contender for sure. I've not tried it yet. I'm very excited to give it a try, but we'll get to that bite-sized review just a little bit later. Like I said, I want today to be all about dreams for 2026. So I'm debating whether I start with the world of bourbon, my YouTube channel, or my personal life. I feel like I'll start with the personal life stuff just to get that out of the way so we can get back to talking about bourbon. So if you've been following my journey, I was laid off at the end of October, and it's a really big deal because this past job I had was probably the most aligned with my career goals that I've ever had. But I am very, very hopeful for my future. Not only have I met some incredible people at my previous company, but all of our agencies, all of our partners, I just had this wonderful new network of people that I'm hoping are going to help me land the next role in early 2026. I hope so, at least. You know, it's funny. I've been asked by quite a few people if I'm looking to do a bit of a career pivot and get into something different than I've done in the past. And it's a great question. You know, I love the bourbon industry. I love the whiskey industry. I know that there's PR agencies that are incredible. I've worked with several of them on the channel. So I'm not ruling it out, but I don't want to think of it as a career pivot because I think my creativity and my skills really benefit from staying in the entertainment space. Now, of course, I went from educational television at my last role to prime time entertainment at my most recent role. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I think the world of entertainment is such a big part of my life, just as a film watcher, as a fan of so many incredible TV series. I'm not quite ready to leave that industry yet. So I think my next role will still be in the industry, but I'm not opposed to exploring a little bit outside the lines and maybe venturing into some product marketing, maybe some, alcoholic beverages. We'll see. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I just want to give that update. I know a few people have been asking, and I appreciate all your thoughts and well wishes. But yeah, so that's my personal life. Let's talk about what I want to do with Bourbon Bytes in 2026. I haven't thought too much about the long-term goals in a while. Since starting back up the podcast, I think of it week to week. What I've built with the Bourbon Bytes podcast so far has been incredible. I love hearing your feedback on these episodes. I know a lot of you guys don't listen to too many podcasts, but this is one of the ones you choose to listen to, and that does mean the world to me. I want to continue to provide a source for whiskey and video game news that's not just drawn out over an hour or two of content. I really want to give it to you straight and to the point, and also mix in my opinions and reviews along with it. I love doing my live streams where I talk for an hour or more about Whiskey Flight, or invite a guest on to talk about their brand. I know this past week I just went live with Jazz from Bardstown Bourbon Company, and we talked almost an hour and a half just sharing our stories and love of bourbon. So if you missed that live stream, go check it out. But for the channel, I really, really enjoy doing interviews with guests. I think this comes from my background of being a video editor. I used to edit interviews with students and alumni and professors with my college back at College of Charleston when I was a student there. And I love shaping a story out of people's experiences. So being the person not just behind the camera or in the editor's chair, but being the person asking them questions and getting to know their story and the story of their brand is really fun to me. And I hope you guys see that in the content I put out on YouTube. This week, by the way, I'm having another guest on. It should be an absolutely fun one and definitely a different one. This week, we're having on the folks from Branch and Barrel Distilling out of Colorado. I've never had any of their whiskeys, but they were very generous. They sent me a core lineup flight, which we're doing on this week's episode. And then in early 2026, probably January or February, we're doing a part 2 where we try some of their more experimental products. So I love featuring both big brands like Bardstown Bourbon Company and small craft distilleries like Branch and Barrel. Of course, I always feel like the brand's evolving, not just the podcast, but the YouTube channel. I'm really finding my voice in the industry. And I think, 2026 could bring a whole new audience into Bourbon Bites. So we might change things up anyway. But if you have any suggestions for the YouTube channel or the podcast, just let me know. All right. And before I move on to the bourbon industry in general, I do want to say for the Byte Club or my Patreon members, this is the season that I am most thankful for your support. I want you to know that I see you. I see you coming out and watching the live streams, listening to the episode of the podcast, and just showing your support in big ways. So I want to say thank you all so much for the support throughout the year. You really do make this possible, especially when I, lost my day job. Buying bottles was not at the forefront of my mind, but then I remembered that this community is amazing. You guys are allowing me to buy fun bottles to review and give you my honest feedback and thoughts. And I think you guys appreciate it. At least I hope you appreciate it, or else why would you support me? But I just want to say a quick thank you again for everyone throughout 2025 that has joined or rejoined the Byte Club or the Patreon. Thank you for making 2025 a year for the books. It's been incredible. And lastly, what do I hope for the bourbon and whiskey industry for 2026? Wow, what a loaded question. I can't believe I asked it to myself. Oh well, let's get into it. The bourbon industry is in kind of a weird space right now because while I am seeing bottles appear on the shelves that I've never seen on the shelves before, I also feel like it's a sign of the times where people say, has the bourbon bubble busted? But I feel like 2026 is going to be a pivotal year in the world of American whiskey. I will say I just was in the grocery store and my local Bevmo today. I saw E.H. Taylor Small Batch, I saw Eagle Rare, I saw Blanton's on the shelves, guys. So this kind of sets this tone of what's coming in 2026. And I don't think anyone can really predict it. What I will say is I do have hopes and dreams for this next year in bourbon, especially. One, I want to see brands continue to release high-aged quality products at a reasonable price. I talked about last week that Knob Creek 12 Cask Strength might be making a comeback in early 2026, and I hope that at least is somewhat more available than the previous release. Listen, we've had so many craft whiskey brands come out in the past 5 to 10 years. I appreciate what they've done, but what I want to see is the flagship bourbon and whiskey brands in the US releasing more higher age, maybe higher proof products. Proof is more of a variable depending on, why they choose to release it at higher proof. And I think we're heading that way. I think it's just going to take a little bit of time because there are brands like the one I'm going to review on this week's episode where they've been known as being this high profile, high end brand. And they're kind of like, where do we price our 4-year-old bourbon? I think that could be a dilemma that their marketing and their distribution teams are facing. But I think this year will be, like I said, a pivotal transition year where we'll start to see prices regulating a little bit, maybe either coming down or just having more availability of some harder to find bottles. Both of those I think are wins for the consumer. And I think both of those things will happen this year. I just don't know how long it'll take for them to actually reflect across the country because everyone's market is different. You know what I selfishly also want to see? I want to see more of these big brands reaching out to influencers that aren't the big guys. Reach out to the smaller influencers because guess what? We all have a voice in this industry. I love Whiskey Advocate. I love Fred Minnick, all of these major channels and people that give incredible reviews that I am even influenced by. But I think what they're missing out on is what a lot of smaller brands are capitalizing on. There are so many smaller creators in the bourbon and whiskey space that if you send them media samples of your bottle, they're all going to be talking about it. And when they're talking about it, their audience is talking about it. That's why I see brands spring up out of nowhere just because the distributor or the brand took a chance on smaller influencers. And I say smaller, but really look at the world of whiskey tubers or whiskey podcasters these days. They're releasing their own brands. They're doing their own picks. They're, having more influence than just talking about whiskey. They're actually either making it or blending it or picking it. They really are having a hands-on impact in the world of whiskey and whiskey culture as we know it, especially American whiskey. Of course, Scotch, and Irish whiskey and Canadian whiskey, they're all going to be affected by the tariff situation. It's something that I'm very aware of, but I don't really think I have any influence on. So I don't talk about it too much because I don't think we're at a point where that's going to be up to the people. I think that's very much up to whoever feels that they have the power to do that. I'll just leave it at that. But I'm talking about the American whiskey, the bourbon market, the rye whiskey market. I think it's going to be a promising year in 2026. And my fingers are crossed that other markets will be just as promising in terms of availability and price. We'll see. We'll see what happens. Like I said, I did a bunch of rambling this week's episode, a little bit different than normal. But of course, we are still in for our bite-sized review. Today we have a really interesting whiskey to review because it looks like a bottle that people get very, very excited for. Of course, I'm talking about the new Willett Family Estate small batch bourbon that's been aged for 4 years and bottled at cask strength. Now, Willett is a brand that has a lot of opinions about it. So, of course, the Willett pot still bourbon, which is, their lower end bourbon, gets a lot of flack for being one of the most overpriced bourbons in the industry. Now, Willett rye whiskey, on the other hand, is a 4-year-old product that some people really enjoy. And of course, on the far, far end of the spectrum, Willett has had some purple top bourbon whiskey releases aged from 4, 9, 12, all the way up to, I think, 14 and 15 years old, where they've been sourcing from different distilleries to release a hyper-aged product with a very hefty price tag. Now, Willett has actually been distilling their own distillate for a while now, and we're starting to see that pop up in those purple top releases. Some people have very good feelings about it, while others feel like it doesn't quite stand up to the Willett purple tops of years prior. Well, today we have a brand new product in the Willett lineup that I'm actually pretty excited for. So this is the new purple top. Yes, I say purple top because there's purple tin foil on the top. It is a 4-year-old small batch bourbon whiskey. Like I said, bottled at cask strength, 125 proof. And this is their own distillate. But what makes this even more special is it's not a rare release. This is actually going to be a core product in their lineup moving forward. So I picked this up from my local spirits store for $70, which is relatively high for a 4-year-old bourbon. But with it carrying the Willett Family Estate name, I had certain expectations based on that. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of Willett rye whiskey. I think their rye whiskey has a very distinct flavor profile that just doesn't vibe with my palate. I couldn't tell you what it is, but every time I've had Willett rye, I've been disappointed by it. Willett Bourbon, on the other hand, my only experience with it has been some of the super high-end bottles where it goes for $300-$400. And while I thought it was pretty darn good, I didn't think it was a $300 to $400 good. So that's why I'm very excited for a chance to try Willett Bourbon at the $70 price point. I hesitate a little bit because 70 is a bit much, but for a new product, I had to pick it up for you guys. Again, shout out to the Byte Club for making this possible. Let's go ahead and get this poured. Now, I will admit I did do a little bit of investigating for other people's opinions on this bottle before I decided to review it. I did hear a few mixed opinions on this release in particular, one of which comes from another incredible whiskey tuber, Drums and Drams, Cameron. He had a hot take on this one, and I think his was more of an issue with Willett in general with their overpricing of their products, and I think that's a totally valid point. I have less personal experience with that. Like, I haven't really bought any of their high-end offerings, but I do think it's a valid perspective. So if you are someone that has those feelings towards Willett, check out his video. He did a review of this particular bottle, and he he had some pretty strong opinions, but you know what? I commend him for it. I also share my honest thoughts on these podcasts, so I would never shame someone for their honest opinion. But I'm not going to be influenced by it, is what I'll say, because I have seen people on Reddit that are very excited to get their hands on this release, being their first chance to buy a Willett bourbon, especially in the family estate line with the purple top presentation at a affordable price. Part of the dilemma is the fact that they're using the same bottlings for this as their bottles for their, like I said, 12, 14, 15-year-old family estate bourbons, which sometimes are sourced, sometimes they're their own distillate, but those are going for hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So I could see why someone feels like something like this might cheapen the lineup or the brand. But again, I'm not someone that does buy those Willets for that price, so I'm not as impacted by that, but it's a valid opinion. I'm excited. I hope you are too. First off, we're going to give it a nose. Ooh, nice. Quite a bit of cinnamon. That is like cinnamon just coming off of it. Almost reminds me of a cinnamon brushed dessert, like where the cinnamon sugar is kind of just sitting on the top. Very sweet on the nose as well. There's a bright quality to it, and I can't tell if it's quite citrus or if it's more of just like a bright, sugary candy note. I'm going to have to go a little bit deeper on the nose to find out what's going on there. And as I try to do so, the ethanol shows itself. Like I said, this is cask strength. It's bottled at 125 proof. You are getting quite a bit of that ethanol on the nose, but that's not to be unexpected with something that's this high proof and relatively young in the world of bourbon. I think that's, just to be expected. Honestly, like, all things considered, I think this is a great nose. It's not complex. It's not, taking me on a journey like some whiskeys do. It's very straightforward, but it's a nose that I like. There's not much oak. There's a lot of cinnamon, and there's just a good backbone of a vanilla sweet spirit. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a taste because the nose, while not overwhelming or super interesting, it does have my mouth watering. So I'm going to go for a taste. Cheers. Oh, wow. Sweet. Wow. Super sweet. I guess that's to be expected, right? It's a 4-year-old bourbon, which is relatively young in terms of bourbon. It has a lot of that corn sweetness from it, but I don't think it necessarily tastes grainy. Like, it doesn't taste like an overly corny bourbon. By the way, mash bill in this is 2 different mash bills, actually, they combined for this. 70% of it is a 52% corn, 38% rye, and 10% barley mash bill, while 30% of it is a 72% corn, 13% rye, and 15% barley mash bill. I will say that high rye mash bill is definitely making an appearance, but I don't think it tastes like a Willett rye whiskey. And for me, who's not a fan of that, that's just a compliment to this bourbon. I will say flavor, the more you sip on it, it does kind of go a little bit one note. It does feel a bit light, a little bit like a cinnamon sugar kind of bomb. Finish wise, not that long. Let's be real. It's not like the longest finish I've had on a bourbon, especially at that proof, at 125 proof. It kind of just sits on the tongue. It kind of just stays as it is and doesn't really take you on a mouthfeel or, throating journey. Throating journey. Wow. I'm not going to use that term ever again. Please don't let me. I will say, even though it's one note, it is a pleasant note. It's a sweeter, a little bit of spicy. Again, none of the wood or oak or anything you would expect from a bourbon. It's that unique. It's almost like I don't want to say this, but it kind of reminds me of like a Canadian whiskey or something that doesn't have as much of an oak influence as a bourbon does. You're really not getting that influence of the white oak barrels, which they put on their label, hand-selected white oak barrels. You're not getting much influence from that. You're just getting a very sweet, very corn-forward and rye-forward distillate. I think it is a testament for a good distillate. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that what's in this bottle tastes good, and I can't wait to see what something like this would taste at a higher age. And that's the problem, right? Because Willett, based on their history, if they age this even just 3 years longer, it's going to be a lot more expensive of a product. I think this would, do much better at a 6 to 9 year age statement. But they maybe shouldn't be using the same bottle they're using for their high-end bourbon. I think some people are going to be confused. I think some store owners are going to take advantage of that confusion and price this bottle up there way beyond the MSRP for it. I can just see that happening. Unfortunately, that's the way this industry works. People are taken advantage of all the time. But I don't want that to diminish the fact that this bourbon is good. I just think it needs a little more age on it to really develop the flavor profile that people love and expect from the Willett lineup. And if they don't want it to, that's fine. But I think the $70 price point needs to come down quite a bit to justify this, what I consider good bourbon. So when I give my review, I consider all things from nose, palate, finish, price, availability, everything all wrapped up into one. With this being a currently $70 bottle, it's relatively available. I think people are buying it because it's new and people see, Willett Purple Top, gotta buy it. Overall, I think this is a fine bourbon. And I think fine is where I'm going to leave my review with it. I'm going to give it a score of 6 out of 10. I think this is better than average. I think what they're working with here is really great distillate. I think it's promising. But the reason it has a 6 out of 10 is I think it is quite a bit overpriced. I think if you are a fan of the Willett lineup and you like their mash bill, give it a try. But if you're used to some of their higher end offerings from, like I said, the 9, 10, 12-year-old releases, this isn't going to be up to par with that. And it shouldn't be, being under $100. But I even feel like this, you're kind of giving into the hype a little bit by paying $70 for it. I think that if this was like a $50 bottle, this would probably get quite a bit higher of a score from me. Not too much higher. Like, I don't want to start throwing out numbers and stuff, but I think at $70, it's a solid 6 out of 10. Good bourbon, good base. I'm excited to see where it goes. I'm, a fan of the flavor profile, more so than I thought I would be because I don't like their rye. So we're actually pretty happy that I like their bourbon. For being someone that's not really into Willett, I think this is a solid addition to the lineup. Could just be a little bit cheaper is all I have to say about that. Let me know what you think. You can join our Discord server again, bourbonbytes.com. There's a link to it there. I want to know what you guys think about this one. Have you tried it yet? Are you looking forward to trying it? Or are you going to give it a pass because of the reputation? I'm very curious to hear what you guys have to say about it. All right, well, with that wraps up this week's episode. Again, this is the last episode of 2025. Thank you all so much for the support, whether you're listening, liking on your favorite podcast platform, or leaving a review and following. It all makes a huge difference. But most of all, I'm just glad you guys are here. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you have a wonderful holiday season and a fantastic new year. Here's to 2026. May it be fruitful and delicious. Cheers. This has been Bourbon Bites. I'll see you guys next year.